Meet Georgina Henry. She is Ridgemont High School's resident queen bee. In fact, some may even call her the HBIC. Emphasis on the B because she is the meanest, most two-faced person you will ever meet. And yet, she's the most popular girl in school. In fact, her best friend Casey Stork, who Georgina treats very poorly, still manages to stick by Georgina's side despite all this abuse and mistreatment. Now, this is a classic example of a toxic relationship. And you may be thinking, well, why doesn't Casey just stop being friends with Georgina? Well, this is a lot easier said than done because if you take a look at your own life, you might find out that you yourself were in a toxic relationship at one point or another. But don't worry, it's not your fault. Our minds tend to play tricks on us that make toxic people seem not so horrible. And there are three main psychological concepts that play into this. One being instrumental conditioning, another being obedience, and a third being cognitive dissonance. And I'll explain why. So Georgina tends to make a lot of sly digs at Casey, like, that shirt is so not your color, or your hair's fugly, go fix it. And then on the off chance, she might give Casey a compliment like, your makeup is decent today. And these compliments are like a drug to Casey. And this is because the rewarding feeling of being treated nicely by someone who usually abuses you tends to overshadow your memories of the general mistreatment. But why is this? Well, toxic individuals like Georgina tend to use instrumental conditioning. And this relies on the premise that if you reward a certain behavior, like catering to a toxic individual, it will increase that behavior. But what happens when the reward becomes infrequent, like it would be in a toxic relationship? Well, then it becomes something we like to call a variable ratio reinforcement schedule. And this is when the behavior or the reinforcement of being treated nicely comes at such inconsistent times. And because these inconsistent times happen, the responder actually has to respond more consistently because they have no idea when the reward is actually coming. So they might respond to a toxic individual consistently in hopes that the next time that they do, they will receive that reward of being treated nicely. And because of this, we end up catering to toxic people a lot more than we should. Now, in order to want validation as a reward from someone, they have to have some sort of authority over you. So Georgina has social power over Casey. So Georgina is popular amongst her peers, so whenever they hang out, she transfers some of that social status onto Casey. And this makes Casey want to act in a way that's desirable for Georgina. So for example, Casey might see herself as a model student, but she also might let Georgina copy her history paper word for word, or else Georgina will send embarrassing pictures of Katie to the entire school. And this is total social suicide, and that'll take away the social status that Casey so desperately clings on to. Now you can see how this type of power dynamic can become a lot more extreme in other cases of abusive relationships, such as a toxic significant other who has financial power over you and your family, or an abusive boss who has control over your job status. And this makes obedience seem that much more imperative to the continuation of the relationship, as well as self-preservation. Now, as onlookers of toxic relationships, well, we think we can never be as obedient or as submissive as the victims of the toxic relationship. But let me tell you something, you're wrong. And this is because people are very bad judges of their own behavior, especially when it comes to obedience. And let me prove it to you. So, in a Hoffling 1966 experiment, an unfamiliar man posing as a doctor on the phone called nurses and gave them the order to give a Confederate patient a drug that was way above the recommended dose. Now, if these nurses actually followed that order, they would be breaking so many nursing rules, such as don't administer more than the recommended dose, don't take orders over the phone, and especially don't take orders from strangers. Now, they asked nursing students, well, how many of you actually think that you will obey this order? And only 6% of people said that they would, but guess what? 95% of them actually did when they conducted the experiment. So if we're this likely to show obedience to a random stranger over the phone, just imagine how much more likely we are to obey someone who has emotional power over us when they try to get us to stay in the toxic relationship. We as humans are emotional creatures, and when toxic people pander to these emotions as well as our disposition to stay in toxic relationships, it's just that much more difficult to escape their poisonous grasp that they have on us. Now, finally, our behavior of keeping a toxic person in our lives is incongruent with the attitude that they are bad for us. Now, this creates what we like to call cognitive dissonance, and that's the discomfort that we feel when our attitudes and our behaviors don't match up. So, because of this discomfort, we feel we need to change one of these two things. So, the easier one of the two to change is our attitudes. So, Casey might actually think that by keeping this person in her life, this toxic person like Georgina, she feels the need to change her attitude to satisfy this discomfort. And she might think that Georgina actually isn't so bad and is still her friend. Now, I know that not everyone suffers from the classic mean girls toxic relationship, but toxic relationships are actually a lot more insidious in our lives than we like to realize. So this might come as an overbearing parent or an abusive significant other. But the key here is that our psychology is a lot more natural to us than we like to give it credit for. And people might take advantage of it and sway us in directions that we shouldn't be going in. But hopefully now that I've shown you the signs of toxicity, you can change your behavior and leave the relationship. Thank you.